September 14, 1987. Haskell County, Kansas. Earl Dobbins was elbow-deep in a busted water pump when the silver Cadillac turned off the county road. He heard it before he saw it, the kind of car that makes gravel apologize for existing, all chrome trim and a horn that played two notes instead of one. Earl didn't look up. He had a gasket that needed persuading and a wrench that wasn't cooperating, and neither of those problems cared about Cadillacs. The car rolled to a stop 10 feet from the barn. The door opened. Two ostrich skin boots hit the ground like they expected a red carpet and were mildly offended by its absence. Dobbins. Earl wiped his hands on a rag that had given up being a rag 3 years ago. He looked up. Standing in his yard, wearing a tan Stetson that had never once been rained on, was Clifton Barrow, owner of the Barcy Ranch, 1,200 acres of prime Kansas grassland, and the single most expensive set of opinions in the county. Clifton, Earl said. That was it. Just Clifton. Earl had a gift for using a man's name as a complete sentence. Clifton didn't notice, or didn't care. He was already looking past Earl, past the barn, past the chicken coop, to the thing that had apparently driven him 4 miles down a county road on a Tuesday morning. He raised one hand and pointed like a man who had practiced pointing. That windmill, he said. Earl turned and looked at his windmill the way a man looks at something he has looked at every day for 31 years. It stood 60 feet tall at the edge of the south pasture, turning slow in the September breeze. It was rust red. It was loud on a windy day. One of the lower fins had a dent in it from a hailstorm in 1974. It pumped water from 140 feet below ground, every single day, without complaint, which was more than Earl could say for most people. What about it? Earl said. Clifton pulled his sunglasses down and looked at Earl over the rims like a man about to deliver a medical diagnosis. It's an eyesore, Earl. An absolute eyesore. I can see that thing from my east fence line. I had guests out this past weekend, people from Wichita, business people, and you know what they saw when they looked east? That. He pointed again, firmly, as if the windmill might need to be identified a second time. Said Earl. It's rusted through. It looks like it's been dead for 40 years. I don't understand how you let a thing go like that. It's embarrassing for the whole road. He paused. No offense. Earl picked up the pump gasket and studied it. None taken. I'm just saying, Earl, there are standards. Some of us have put real money into this land. Real improvements. You drive past my operation, you see something worth looking at. New grain bins, new equipment shed, the arena I put in last spring. Did you see the arena? I saw the arena. $40,000. I heard. And then you come down this road and you see another point that. It's like finding a cigarette but in a wedding cake, Earl. It just doesn't fit. Earl set the gasket down carefully on the tailgate of his truck. He rubbed his jaw. He looked at the windmill. He looked at Clifton Barrow, who was still wearing that never-rained-on hat and those never-worked-in boots, and he looked at him for a long time, the way a man looks at a math problem he already knows the answer to. Then Earl Dobbins did something Clifton clearly did not expect. He smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a sorry for the trouble smile. The slow, unhurried smile of a man who has just been handed the one thing he needed. You're right, Earl said. Clifton blinked. I am? That windmill is an eyesore. You've opened my eyes, Clifton. I appreciate that. He picked up the pump gasket again and turned back toward the barn. I'll see to it. Clifton stood in the yard another moment, hat slightly tilted, looking as though he had prepared for a longer argument and wasn't quite sure what to do with the extra material. Then he nodded, satisfied with himself, got back in the Cadillac, and rolled back down the gravel road with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has just improved the neighborhood. Earl watched the car disappear. Then he went inside, poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting since 6 in the morning, and sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. He wrote 2 words at the top. Gold paint. Earl Dobbins had farmed this land since 1956, when his father handed him the deed and a handshake and said, approximately, don't mess it up. He had not messed it up. He ran 110 head of Angus, kept 30 acres in winter wheat, maintained a kitchen garden that his wife Loretta called excessive and his neighbors called the best source of tomatoes in 3 counties. He did all of this without debt, without drama, and without the kind of $40,000 arena that required a sign at the gate explaining what it was for. He was 63 years old. His hands looked like a topographical map of the American West. He wore the same Wranglers 4 days running if they were still structurally sound, and he considered a shirt with a button missing to be perfectly wearable as long as it wasn't the top one. The community had various ways of describing Earl Dobbins. At the co-op, they said he was the most stubborn man in Haskell County, which they meant as a compliment. At the Methodist Church, they said he was steady, which is what Methodists say about a man who never changes and is usually right. His neighbor to the north, Herb Pfluger, had once said that arguing with Earl Dobbins was like arguing with a fence post, except the fence post was better at listening and more likely to eventually see your point. The windmill had been there since 1948. Earl's father had installed it. It was a Airmotors 702, built in Chicago, designed to operate for 100 years with nothing but occasional lubrication and a willingness to let it do its job. It had survived a tornado in 1965 that took the Pfluger barn. It had survived 3 droughts. It pumped 12 gallons per minute through hard Kansas limestone. It was, in the technical opinion of every rancher who had ever seen it work, one of the finest windmills in the county. It was also, admittedly, extremely rusty. Earl had never painted it because paint on steel in a Kansas winter tends to flake, and flaking paint tends to clog cattle waterers, and clogged cattle waterers create problems that are significantly more annoying than rust. The rust, for its part, was a perfectly respectable surface rust, not structural, not spreading, not doing anything except existing as a natural consequence of being made of iron and existing in the atmosphere. But Clifton Barrow had guests from Wichita, apparently. And Clifton Barrow could see it from his east fence line. And Clifton Barrow had decided that Earl's windmill was embarrassing for the whole road. Earl finished his cold coffee and looked at his legal pad. He wrote a few more words. Then a few more. Then he tore off the sheet, folded it twice, and put it in his shirt pocket. He picked up the telephone and called his nephew Dale, who ran an equipment rental place in Liberal and owed Earl a favor from the time Earl had not told Dale's wife where Dale actually was on the weekend. He was supposedly at a farm auction in Dodge City. "I need a spotlight," Earl said. "What kind of spotlight?" "The kind that is visible from a considerable distance." There was a pause on the line. "Earl, what are you doing?" "Improvements," Earl said. "Call it community beautification." It took Earl 11 days, which was 9 days longer than it needed to take and 2 days shorter than anyone who saw the finished result would have believed possible. The project required 14 quarts of oil-based alkyd paint in the color the hardware store catalog listed as Harvest Gold, which was a name designed to make a color slightly less alarming than it actually was. 3 quarts of clear coat for weather protection. A rented scaffold from Dale's place in Liberal. 1 500-watt outdoor spotlight with a swivel mount, purchased from an electrical supply house in Garden City. 40 feet of direct burial electrical cable. A timer switch. And approximately 115 feet of Earl's patience, which was in abundant supply. His neighbor Herb Pfluger came over on day 3 and stood at the fence line for 10 minutes watching Earl paint before saying anything. "Earl." "Herb. Are you painting the windmill gold?" "Harvest Gold," Earl said, from the scaffold. Herb looked at the paint can. He looked at the windmill. He looked at the 2/3 that were still rust red and the 1/3 that was now a color that could be described charitably as aggressively cheerful. "Earl, I have to ask. Did Clifton Barrow come over here and say something about this windmill?" "He did." "And now you're painting it gold?" "I am." Herb rubbed the back of his neck. He had a particular neck-rubbing gesture that meant he was calculating whether to say the thing he was thinking or the thing that would keep the peace. "And the spotlight?" He had seen Dale's truck arrive that morning. "For visibility," Earl said. Clifton mentioned his guests had trouble appreciating the windmill from his east fence line. "I want to make sure that's no longer a problem." Herb stood there another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, and Earl could see his shoulders moving in a way that suggested he was laughing hard enough that he didn't want Earl to see it. Loretta came out on day 6 with 2 cups of coffee and stood below the scaffold looking up at the now 3/4 gold windmill turning in the afternoon light. It caught the sun in a way that could only be described as enthusiastic. "Earl Dobbins," she said. "Loretta. You are going to be the talk of 3 counties. I expect so. People are going to drive out here to look at this thing. I expect so." She handed him a cup and looked up at it a while longer. The fins turned. The gold paint caught a cloud reflection and threw it back. It was, objectively, one of the most visible objects in Haskell County. "You're not going to stop at the paint, are you?" she said. "The spotlight goes in Thursday," Earl said. Loretta took a sip of her coffee. "I want it known that I'm both opposed to this and fully supportive of this." "I'll note that down," Earl said. The spotlight went in on Thursday. Earl ran the electrical line from the barn, buried it 18 inches deep the way the code said, and mounted the fixture on a treated post he sank 4 feet into the ground beside the windmill's base. The swivel mount let him aim the beam at any angle. He pointed it straight up the tower so that the light hit the spinning head and threw the rotating fins against the Kansas night sky like a weather vane designed by someone who had suffered a head injury but remained optimistic. He set the timer for dusk to dawn. He went inside for dinner. At 7:43 p.m., with the sun down and the stars just coming out over the south pasture, the spotlight clicked on. Earl's kitchen window faced south. He was eating a pork chop when the window turned the color of something between a trophy and a traffic cone. Loretta looked up from her plate. "Lord Almighty," she said. "Good visibility," Earl said. "Earl, I can read my fork by that light. It's 500 watts. I can see our dishes in the reflection. Might need to redirect it slightly," Earl allowed. He went out and turned it 3 degrees east. Now it lit the windmill from below and slightly behind, so that the spinning fins threw long golden shadows across the south pasture that rotated slowly as the blades turned. In the dark, at a distance, it looked not entirely unlike a very small lighthouse that had been placed in Kansas by someone who was trying to send a message. The next morning Earl drove to the Highway 83 junction, turned around, and drove back, looking east toward his property the whole way. You could see the windmill even in daylight from 1.25 miles. He noted this on his legal pad and went to feed the cattle. Clifton Barrow noticed on day 14. He was driving his guests, different ones this time, a couple from Wichita who were thinking about buying land down the county road toward his property, pointing out his grain bins and his new equipment shed, running through the amenities of the Barcy Ranch in the practiced tone of a man who had given this tour several times, when the woman in the back seat said, "Oh, what's that?" Clifton looked. There was Earl's windmill, turning slowly in the October wind. Gold. The spotlight had not yet come on, it was mid-afternoon, but in the fall light, the harvest gold paint threw a color across the stubble field that was entirely impossible to overlook. The fins caught the sun and flashed rhythmically, like a very unhurried disco ball. "That's just a neighbor's windmill," Clifton said. "It's incredible," the woman said. "It's like a piece of art." Her husband pressed his face to the window. "Is that gold? Is that real gold?" "It's paint," Clifton said. "We have to get a photo," the woman said. The car slowed down. Clifton's jaw tightened in a way that suggested significant internal pressure. Both guests had their phones out before the car had fully stopped, leaning out the windows to get the windmill in frame, telling each other things like "get the whole thing" and "try to get the blades." "Should we knock?" the woman asked. "I'd love to meet whoever did this." "We should move along," Clifton said, in the tone of a man watching something go wrong and lacking any mechanism to stop it. They moved along. But the woman had already posted 2 photos to her Instagram account, tagged as #KansasSurprise and #UnexpectedArt, from the passenger window of a moving Cadillac. By the next morning the post had 112 likes. Clifton called on day 16. Earl was back at the water pump. The gasket had failed again when the phone rang in the barn. He had a cordless unit out there that Loretta had insisted on and that Earl had never been grateful for until this particular moment. Earl. Clifton's voice had a quality that might be called controlled disturbance. Clifton. I see you painted the windmill. I did. You said it was an eyesore. I spruced it up. A pause. You painted it gold. Harvest gold, Earl said. It's in the catalog. Earl, it looks like a Clifton searched for the word. It looks like something that belongs in Las Vegas. I think it has character, Earl said. Your guests seemed to appreciate it. The pause this time was significantly longer. How do you know about that? Herb Pfluger's wife follows the Instagram, Earl said, and he delivered this sentence with the complete serenity of a man who did not personally use the Instagram and was not entirely certain how it worked but understood its effects. Earl, I came to you because that windmill looked bad. And now it looks visible? Earl offered. Ridiculous. Clifton, a thing that pumps 12 gallons per minute through limestone from 140 feet down and has been doing it since 1948, has earned the right to look however it wants. Earl put down his wrench. And besides, I added the spotlight for the nighttime. There was a sound on the phone that was difficult to categorize. For the nighttime, Clifton repeated. So your guests can appreciate it even after dark. You mentioned visibility was a concern. I took that seriously. Another sound. Earl, the spotlight, Clifton stopped. He started again. There is a rotating beam of light hitting your windmill every night that I can see from my bedroom window. I'll take that as a compliment, Earl said. It is not a compliment. Your guests seem to feel differently, Earl said. That Instagram post has 244 likes as of this morning. Loretta checks it for me. Clifton hung up. Earl picked up his wrench and went back to the gasket. The thing Clifton Barrow had not accounted for was how rural Kansas works. In cities, a gold windmill with a spotlight might cause one neighbor to complain to another neighbor and eventually to a homeowners association that would send a sternly worded letter and eventually a code enforcement officer. But Haskell County did not have a homeowners association. Haskell County had a feed store where people talked, a Methodist church where people talked slower, and a county road that anyone with curiosity and a pickup could drive down on any evening they chose. By the end of the third week, people were driving down that county road on purpose. Not many. Not a parade. But a pickup would slow at the end of Earl's drive, and someone would climb out to look at the windmill turning in the evening light, and someone would take a photograph. Loretta started waving from the porch out of basic Kansas courtesy, and people started waving back, and once two retired schoolteachers from Sublette asked if they could come closer to see it, and Earl said yes, and Loretta brought out coffee, and they stayed for 45 minutes. One of the schoolteachers posted her photograph to a Facebook group called Kansas Hidden Gems. The post got 400 likes. Herb Pfluger came over that Saturday and reported this with the expression of a man watching something happen that he will be telling people about for the rest of his life. Earl, he said, people in the Facebook group are calling it a landmark. Said Earl. Someone called it a defiant statement about the dignity of working infrastructure. What does that mean? I don't know, Herb said, but 312 people agreed with it. Loretta brought out cookies. Herb ate 4 of them and kept checking his phone. The following Wednesday, a man arrived in a Subaru wagon with a camera that cost more than Earl's first tractor. He was from a magazine in Wichita called Kansas Living, and he wanted to photograph the windmill for a feature on unexpected rural beauty. Earl let him, because there was no reason not to. The photographer spent 2 hours in the south pasture and took 411 photographs, of which he ultimately used 3, 2 of which ran as a full spread in the November issue. The caption said, Earl Dobbins' 1948 Air Motor 702 stands as a testament to working longevity, its owner's recent renovations transforming a functional landmark into a piece of living folk art. Earl read this in the kitchen and said and Loretta said you're famous, and Earl said I'm eating lunch, and that was the end of that conversation. Clifton saw the magazine on November 8th. He was at the feed store in Sublette, standing in line to pay for mineral blocks, when he saw the October-November issue of Kansas Living face up on the counter where people left reading material. He would have walked right past it except that the cover, in the lower right corner, had a small inset photo of a gold windmill under a night sky with a caption that said "See page 34, the accidental landmark." He opened to page 34. He read the feature. He stood in line at the Sublette feed store for the better part of 3 minutes, reading about his neighbor's windmill, which was described as quietly majestic and a pointed reminder that old things earn their keep. The man in line behind him said, "You know that guy?" Clifton looked up. "We're neighbors." "That windmill is something," the man said. "My daughter drove out there last week to see it. She said it's beautiful." Clifton paid for his mineral blocks and walked to his truck. He sat in the parking lot for a moment. Then he drove to Earl's place. Earl was mending fence on the north side of the property when the silver Cadillac appeared again on the county road. He watched it turn up the drive and stop near the barn, and he climbed through the wire and walked over unhurried, the way a man walks when he is in no particular hurry and knows it. Clifton was standing by the car with the magazine in his hand. "Earl," he said. "Clifton." Clifton held up the magazine. Then he put it down. He took off the never-rained-on hat and held it by the brim, which was something Earl had never seen him do before. "I came over a few weeks back and said your windmill was embarrassing." "You did," Earl said. "And I said it looked like a cigarette but in a wedding cake." "You did." "And I said it was embarrassing for the whole road." Clifton looked at the windmill. In the November afternoon light, the gold paint had a different quality than it had in September, less aggressive, more settled, the way gold things look once they've been outside for a while and the edge has come off. The spotlight post stood beside it, dormant now in the daylight, ready for evening. "I was wrong," Clifton said. Earl picked up a fence staple from his coat pocket and turned it in his fingers. "You weren't all wrong. It is visible from a considerable distance." Clifton made a sound that was probably a laugh if you'd known him longer. "My guests from Wichita, the ones last month, not the ones from before, they asked me if I knew whose windmill that was. I said yes. They said to tell you it was the best thing they saw all weekend." He paused. "That includes the arena." Said Earl. $40,000, Clifton said, "and the windmill gets the compliment." There was a silence between them that was almost comfortable. An October wind moved through the pasture. The windmill turned. The gold fins caught what remained of the afternoon and threw it back across the dry grass. "Earl," Clifton said, "how does a rusted windmill get to be in a magazine?" Earl looked at it for a moment. It didn't do anything different than it ever did. It just got easier to see. He put the fence staple back in his pocket. A thing that does its job for 39 years doesn't need to apologize for how it looks. It just needed someone to point a light at it. Clifton turned the never-rained-on hat in his hands. He stood there in the yard looking at the gold windmill the way a man looks at something that has just rearranged a small portion of his thinking. Then he put the hat back on and nodded. "Fair enough," he said. They shook hands. Clifton's grip was firm and brief, the grip of a man who respected the transaction even if it cost him something. Earl's grip was the grip of a man who had already moved on. Clifton drove back down the county road. Earl watched him go, then turned and walked back to the fence line. He had 8 more posts to check before dark. By December, 2 things had happened. First, the Kansas Living feature had been shared by a regional television station's Facebook page, which resulted in 200 additional shares and a brief segment on a Wichita evening news program called Kansas Charm, during which Earl appeared for 11 seconds in footage the cameraman had shot on a Tuesday morning, walking toward the windmill with a grease gun. Earl watched this segment once at Herb Pfluger's house, said, "I look shorter than I am on television," and did not watch it again. Second, Clifton Barrow had repainted his new equipment shed. He'd done it in a dark green that matched the cedar breaks along his north fence line. It was a thoughtful choice that someone who paid attention to things might make. He hadn't said anything about it to anyone. He'd just done it quietly, in November, between the first and second cold fronts. Earl noticed when he drove past the Bar C one afternoon in the truck. He didn't say anything either. That was the thing about Haskell County. A man could change his mind and nobody had to make a speech about it. The windmill ran through the winter the way it always had. On cold mornings when the temperature went below 15, Earl would go out and check the tail vane and make sure the furling mechanism was free, the same check he had made every winter for 30 years. The water kept moving. The cattle drank. The fins turned. In February, a woman from an art college in Lawrence wrote Earl a actual letter, envelope and stamp, asking if she could interview him for a research project on vernacular art and functional aesthetics in rural American working culture. Earl read this letter to Loretta at dinner. "What's vernacular mean?" Earl asked. "Ordinary," Loretta said. "Things made by regular people." "And aesthetics?" "How things look." Earl considered this. "She wants to know why I painted the windmill gold." "Yes," Loretta said. "Because Clifton Barrow called it ugly and I disagreed with him." "You should tell her that." "I will," Earl said. He wrote back on the legal pad in his deliberate handwriting, 2 paragraphs, explaining that the windmill had always been functional and that functional things sometimes need to be defended against people who mistake newness for quality, and that gold paint costs $47 a quart but good water costs significantly more. He also mentioned that the spotlight ran on a timer and cost about $9 a month in electricity, which he considered reasonable given the results. The art student wrote back and said his letter was the most concise articulation of folk aesthetic philosophy she had encountered. Earl read this to Loretta and said, "I don't know what that means, but I think she liked the letter." Loretta said, "I think so too." They had dinner. The windmill kept working. That was the part that Clifton had never quite calculated into his complaint, not the paint, not the spotlight, not the magazine or the Instagram or the Kansas Living feature or the art student from Lawrence. The part he had not thought through was that the windmill had been pumping water since 1948, that it had outlasted 3 tractors, 2 barn cats, 1 significant tornado, a 7-year drought, and the entire presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The rust was not a sign of failure. The rust was a receipt. Earl understood this the way he understood most things, not from being told, but from paying attention over a long time. His father had shown him the windmill on a morning in 1956, put a hand on the tower leg, and said, "This thing will be here when both of us are gone. Don't mess with what works." Then he had gone in for coffee. Earl had not messed with what worked. He had simply made it visible. And visibility, it turned out, was a different thing entirely from improvement. The windmill did not need improving. It needed a spotlight and 14 quarts of harvest gold, and then people needed to drive by on a county road and see it doing what it had always done, which was pump 12 gallons per minute from 140 feet below ground without complaint or ceremony. Old things earn their keep. They just sometimes need someone to shine a light on the proof. The spotlight came on at dusk on a January evening and threw its 500-watt beam up the tower, and the gold fins turned against the dark Kansas sky in their slow, unhurried rotation, and the shadows moved across the winter pasture the way they had every evening since October, and Earl Dobbins was inside eating a pork chop and reading the farm journal, and Loretta was across the table with her book, and the kitchen window glowed faintly gold, and nobody in the house paid it any particular attention. For miles east, at the Barcy Ranch, Clifton Barrow was in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and his back to the window, going over feed receipts. He did not look up. But he did, at some point that evening, get up and stand at the kitchen window for a moment before going to bed, looking across the dark fields to where the slow gold light turned in the distance like a lighthouse that had taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up exactly where it needed to be. He stood there long enough that his coffee went cold. Then he went to bed. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. In Haskell County, that was considered one of the finer qualities a man could have. The windmill kept working. Some men spend $40,000 building something worth seeing. Some men spend $47 a quart and let 40 years do the rest.